Every time you post something about yourself, put a picture, anything you put out there, we don't know how people are going to respond. And so when they do respond positively, especially if it's really positively, then it's like hitting a jackpot almost in your brain. When we talk about mental health challenges and even mental illness, it's a spectrum. On some level, we're all on that spectrum. When we think about finding meaning in our lives and depth, that requires sustained attention.
Dr. Daniel Binus, I want to thank you for coming on again. I can't believe it's been in 2024 when we did
Was
our
that the
first
last time?
podcast.
Wow.
Yes. So that's like a year and a half. But I did want to bring you on again because I feel like the topics that we will cover today are very important, just based on the feedback that I received from our previous podcast and also conversations I'm having on daily basis. I think that this is something that we're all being affected by in some ways. As a business owner and a mentor for a few people, I know how to help someone who wants to build a business or seeking some kind of a career advice. However, when it comes to helping someone who's going through, a rough time, maybe going through something mentally, someone who's withdrawn from life, or maybe even abuses some substances, honestly, I know very little on how, and sometimes I just feel hopeless. So I really hope that this conversation will help me, and as well as maybe some people in the audience, to develop some sort of framework and understand what are we dealing here with. So my first question would be to you is why do you think it's so difficult for people who really want to help their loved ones but often feel hopeless and helpless?
That's a great question. And what you commented on earlier is you're right. Most of us, don't know how to help, but we see the issues all around us. All of us have friends and often family members that are close to us that are struggling with various things. And we're seeing more and more of that. It used to be that maybe 100 years ago, it's like, oh yeah, we have, this distant relative or know somebody that's kind of, struggling with some mental health issues, but it was all very, quiet and no one wanted to talk about it. And there was a lot of stigma attached. In recent years, there's, I think, been two big things that have come to the surface. Number one, people are realizing that we all have problems and that it really, when we talk about mental health challenges and even mental illness, it's a spectrum, and on some level, we're all on that spectrum, and so because people are realizing that we all have our issues and our challenges and none of us are perfect, it's also starting to slowly decrease the stigma and open up more conversations along those lines, as far as like people are seeing it more and people are also willing to address it more. But that doesn't mean we have the tools to address it. And I think that's where a lot of us in our families and in our communities, even in our places of work, are really feeling a little stuck. Is like, okay, now, people are more open to talking about it. They're seeing it maybe in myself personally, or, in my family or my workplace, but I don't have the tools to deal with it. And that can be very frustrating, because if you're anything like me, if I see a problem, I want to have some tools and ability to address it.
Yes. Okay, so let's start with a little bit about the social media, because this is something that came into our life not too long ago, when we look at humanity and just how people used to live and connect with each other. Now people connect online. A lot of Americans have embraced social media, but they don't really know, or they're not aware of the effects of social media on their mental health, especially the younger generations. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And it's an important topic to talk about because, and I want to start by saying, I don't want to demonize media and even social media, because sometimes we just hear like, oh, this is terrible, we need to get rid of it. But the truth is there are some really important upsides, I think, of digital media and the things we can do. We can reach so many people, even what we're doing right now, right? A podcast is going to be aired and go out on social media and digital media. That's a wonderful thing. And so we can exchange information, we can exchange ideas, and we can help a lot of people, and we can connect. There's patients that I have, for example, they're like, oh yeah, I was able to connect with, like, 3 classmates through Facebook or through some social media, and I hadn't talked to them for 30 years. That
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of things are wonderful, and they can be amazing. But there is a darker side as well. And so I think, we need to be aware it's not all or nothing. There's a balance that we need to understand, but we need to understand the dangers. It's kind of like, maybe it's not the best analogy, but a chainsaw, right? A chainsaw is a powerful tool and it can be used in a wonderful way, but it can also be very, very dangerous if you're not careful.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Well, what I wanted to mention is this. So let's say someone who is consuming or producing content, right? Um, if you produce content and you have an intention to produce something that is valuable for someone to learn something from your experience, you're studying something, you're researching something, and then you have an opinion and then you put it out. That's one thing. But when it comes to figuring out how the mind works and how their attention is captured in the first couple seconds, and then creating content just for that so that you can keep that person watching and scrolling, then that's a little bit different. And I even found myself a few times kind of fall in this trap where, I go on, let's say, on X,
Mm-hmm.
which used to be Twitter. And there's a few accounts that I follow. And then there's stuff that I don't follow, but comes up on my feed. When I'm
Mm-hmm.
just going through, I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's going on in the world today, And sometimes, like, if I have time and I'm either at home or somewhere, like, and I find myself, like, watching things that I didn't even come on this platform right
Yeah.
now to spend my time and see the stuff. But now I just sat there for 15 minutes and I was just scrolling through stuff. And especially right now, with AI, a lot of videos out there are generated by AI. They're not even
They're
real.
not even real. Yeah.
And so many people, they believe that kind of stuff. Because then, like, I see someone would repost a video or a picture and they would make comment on it, believing that it's really, really real. But in reality, it's just not. And I think that, how do you think it affects, especially the younger generations, when they're not really going on Facebook, right? Where they're reading posts, they're not going on LinkedIn. Those platforms are already, the
For the
past.
ancient people.
Yes, they're going on TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, YouTube Shorts, because YouTube now has really, is really pushing out shorts because they want to compete with TikTok and Instagram. So how does that affect someone, like a young mind who is constantly being, you know, they're constantly scrolling through and getting these this content that is made specifically to capture their attention and keep them on the platform for as long as possible?
Yeah, and that's really when we talk about maybe the darker side of social media and digital media, uh, there is a very vast focus on how do we capture people's attention and keep their attention. And so there's all sorts of media scientists that are involved in this, and they study, the psychology of the human mind to understand how can we not only grab someone's attention but keep their attention, because the more we keep their attention, guess what that means? More money, right? I mean, that's what it ultimately boils down to is
Yes.
is money and control in some ways, or power, you could say. And the two go hand in hand, right? And so basically, one of the things that they have found is there's two major drivers when it comes to really keeping people's attention, most people, okay? And one of those is the sense of positive reinforcement, but it's intermittent reward. So it's kind of like gambling in a way. And I know that might sound kind of strange, but if you think about social media, when it really rose and became very popular was actually when the like button was invented. And so essentially what you have there, let's say you do a post or you put something out there. If you start getting likes, what does that do to you? Well, it gives you a little dopamine hit and it makes you feel like, oh, this is something that other people liked. But when you put something out there, you don't know if you're going to get that hit or not. You
Mm-hmm.
don't know how it's going to be received. And so you're wondering, and if you get the reinforcement, then that's great, but you might not. And so it's kind of a gamble every time you put something out there, every time you post something about yourself, put a picture, anything you put out there, we don't know how people are going to respond. And so when they do respond positively, it's like, especially if it's really positively, then it's like hitting a jackpot almost in your brain, right? And so that's why it's almost a little bit like a slot machine in your
Mm-hmm.
pocket. And so that intermittent positive reinforcement is a huge driver. So that's the first one as far as social media. And then a second aspect is just the social piece itself. We are social human beings by nature. And so having that sense of connection, even if it's, and I want to talk a little bit about that later, like even if it's not the face-to-face sort of connection, again, it can feel good temporarily. And so that can be a driver, and especially, having a sense of belonging to a group and having some sense of having some similarities with that group and belonging.
Mm-hmm. So, when somebody is using some substance, right? At first, it's the dose is pretty small for to get that kind of effect, and then they need a bigger dose and then bigger dose, right? Is it the same thing also with when it comes to social media, that dopamine hit? How long does that last? And if someone consistently is going and constantly going after that over and over, does that also affect them in a way where they need it even now, even more frequently?
Yes, the answer is absolutely. And even though there's a lot of people that hesitate to say that there's truly an addiction to media, more and more science is showing that yes, it's that same dopamine reward circuit, and the same sort of process happens where at first, and you can see this with little kids, they're just like mesmerized with the television, but then over time it's like, oh, it's kind of gets a little boring, and and that's exactly what happens to our brain. It's like, and it doesn't matter. I mean, we're talking more about social media, but the same brain mechanisms are actually active, meaning it's the same brain pathway that is triggered, whether it is watching a movie, watching television, video gaming, the gaming online, or even just regular video gaming, social media. Go on down the list. All of the digital media does the same thing. And what they found, and this is, if you think back to this, like, 60 years ago, what kind of TV shows did we have? We had things like, Lassie, like Leave It to Beaver, these television shows, and they were different. One of the big things, other than some of them being black and white, is that they were much slower moving. So they would focus on one scene for a while, for a few seconds, and then, they would shift to another scene. The scientists found that the more you change screen shots, in other words, the more edits you have, the more you show different angles and different action, and the faster things are moving, the more dopamine is released in the brain. And so that's why nowadays everything is moving very fast, on media. And so that's why you have, instead of, your normal full length YouTube videos, you have shorts, right? Or you have, all these things, but everything has to be short, has to jump from one thing very quickly, one scene to the next, because it triggers more dopamine, more attention. But like you said, over time, you actually get desensitized to that. your brain almost becomes like immune to that, and you're looking for more and more stimulation. And so then either you're trying to find things that are even quicker, or you're multitasking, you're trying to do three things at one time, or you're trying to find more content that is more riveting, more sensational, more exciting, because you're looking for that same level of stimulation in your brain, and your brain is actually getting desensitized.
Wow. Well, I guess that's what explains why kids right now, they just cannot sit around and watch an older movie, even if it's a great movie. They
Yes,
just can't. It's boring to them.
that's exactly it.
Wow. So when we're talking about social media, like what would you say some of the maybe approaches that are more like healthier approach, something that's like some sort of like, I don't know, maybe mid normal area where there's a somewhat of a healthy relationship with the platforms?
hmm That's a great question. And I think I'd like to answer that by going back to this idea of overstimulation. Because what happens if we're used to being so overstimulated a significant portion of our day is, like you said, it's not just other media content that becomes boring, but guess what else becomes boring? Our day-to-day interactions, like sitting down and having a conversation with a friend, and having, tea with a friend, or just even watching a beautiful sunset, or looking up at the night sky, or doing something else that's a little more low key and slower, or listening to a lecture. Oh man, that is really so, these real life experiences actually become very boring. People are just not interested, especially, the young people who have been used to their whole lives being overstimulated. And so, like you said, there is a balance, there is a moderation that's healthy. But the problem is, if we've already been used to being so overstimulated, and we tell people now, okay, well, you should just not use media or use this amount of media, it will literally put people in a state where they almost feel like they're going through withdrawals. And so we have to, when we have that conversation about like what's moderate and what's healthy, we have to think about the process, even what's going on in the brain, and how we can kind of adapt to that, and understand what to expect, so that we can get to that point in maybe a healthy way.
So is it possible to sort of withdraw from that? Let's say if someone is used to, scrolling, let's say 3-4 hours a day, is it realistic for them to like reduce it to maybe 1 hour a day?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is. I think it is. But I think it's important, again, to have realistic expectations in that process, understanding that it's not necessarily going to be a comfortable process. Because when I'm working with my patients and other people, as we educate them about the dangers of media, and then they say, okay, fine, I'm going to try, instead of, like you said, 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to cut back to maybe an hour or hour and a half. And by the way, that is an important point, because as a side note, but I do want to emphasize it, the science actually does show, as far as entertainment media, and I'm not talking about, the work we're doing on our computer, like for work and that sort of thing. I'm talking about entertainment media, which would include all those other things we're talking about. The max that we want to average per day to avoid mental health problems is an hour and a half for adults. Okay. For young people, over age 5, you want to cap it at 1 hour. So from young, a child into young adulthood, you want to try to cap it at 1 hour per day. But again, going from 4, 5, 6, and we're saying 3, 4, 5 hours. I mean, the data actually shows that most people on average, it's over 8 hours a day. Okay. So, so going from, 8 hours down to like 1.5 or 1 hour for children and adolescents is difficult. So we have to think about the logical aspect of that. Now, is it bad to do a sudden detox? Maybe not. But again, you have to be prepared for that mentally, and realize there's going to be a withdrawal, almost like in a way, I hate to say it, but almost like a drug withdrawal. There's going to potentially be some agitation, some irritability, some anxiety. Like, what do I do with my time?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going crazy because I'm so used to being overstimulated, and that can usually take quite some time. Some of the biggest voices on this who have written books, like Cal Newport and Victoria Dunkley, they have some good resources on digital minimalism. They recommend that people take a 30-day detox, basically. Some people say 4 weeks, other people say 6 weeks, but in that realm. And they encourage people to prepare for that. In other words, now, of course, none of us can just completely eliminate all media. I should say almost none of us can completely eliminate
Mm-hmm.
all media and still function in today's world, because we have to work, we have to check our email. There's maybe a certain amount of social media that we need to do to keep in touch with really important people in our lives. But during that detox period, what is recommended is that we make very strict rules for ourselves and say, like, and I've done this actually myself a couple of years ago. It was very helpful. So for myself, I said, okay, I'm only going to, instead of checking my emails like intermittently throughout the day, I'm going to schedule, a couple of times a day to check my emails and go through those, instead of just like, because it's the task switching that can sometimes be
Yes,
a problem,
yes.
right? And then I said, I'm only checking my social media. I think it was like once a week was my rule during the detox for, 20 minutes or something like that. And that's enough for me to keep up with my cousin in Germany and this sort of thing, right? And so I had specific rules, and I basically eliminated anything that was absolutely not necessary. So I was like, okay, no YouTube, no, none of this, none of this, none of this. And so it was very strict for those 30 days. And what it helped me to do, and then of course, I also was thinking about what can I replace that time with, right? Because it's not just doing without, but we want to replace it with something better. So for me, I was like, okay, I'm going to spend more time with my wife and my kids and doing some projects around the house and that sort of thing. And so even though there was some level of discomfort there, I was able to replace that time. It wasn't just a vacuum with other things. And then it was interesting because after a couple weeks, the first couple weeks were the hardest. And that's the way it is with any addiction, anything that is, that we're struggling. The first couple weeks are the hardest. But then after that, my mind actually started to slowly get more and more clear. I started to get more perspective. And towards the end of my detox, I was able to appreciate some more like reality-based things, like real life things. And it was, I was able to more clearly start thinking, okay, now moving forward after my detox, what are my rules moving forward, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
weren't going to be as strict as they were during the detox, but I still started thinking like more intentionally, what are my rules here moving forward? And so it is a process. And of course, adults usually have an easier time doing this. Kids often need help and guidelines doing this. But through that process, there's a lot of good that can come out, and your brain, because it can change, actually starts to be resensitized to the lower stimulation rewards. And then that's when when you really start feeling better. Now you're like, oh wow, I am enjoying some of these things again, like I was maybe before, or maybe I never have before.
That's very, very interesting because I know that some people say that when you go through a fast, like when you're not eating,
Mm-hmm.
like after a few days, like you start having like very clear mind, right?
Yes.
So I wonder if that has something like in common with like a detox from social media, from all the dopamine hits. The same
Mm-hmm.
thing with like detoxing from eating food, like if that has something to do with one another, because like I remember there were moments which were a little more frequently for me where I could, when I would think about something, either some kind of a problem I needed to solve or something I wanted to do in the future, I would find myself being able to really go into like deep thinking
Mm-hmm.
and develop some good ideas, or maybe even be on a plane, and as we're flying, taking a 4-hour flight, like I would get like some like a flow of ideas that I would like write down, and
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I was like, wow, where did that come from? But more like lately, as like, you mentioned task switching, like unfortunately I still find myself doing a lot of that, and I want to, like, this year one of my goals is to try to like eliminate that as much as possible, even
Mm-hmm.
though sometimes I can't help it. But it really affects me, like, especially towards the day. I feel like mentally I just get extremely exhausted,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't find that flow of ideas to come as freely as it used to be.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe has to do with the task switching and the dopamine hits and constantly receiving all this information at that rate where we're not even meant to be, right?
That's right. And to your point, the task switching actually really does take up a lot of our mental resources. It takes a lot of mental energy to switch from one task to the other. And in reality, there's actually no such thing as multitasking. We can only focus on one task at a time. And so, multitasking, what it is in reality, is switching quickly from one task to the next. But every time we switch, we're actually expending more mental energy. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people are dealing with emotional and mental fatigue by the end of the day. And then the other side of that coin, when we think about finding meaning in our lives and depth and being able to, like you said, really think through a process and creativity and these sorts of things, that requires sustained attention. And so, another aspect of the social media and the attention poor economy that we're living in right now is that we are actually more and more living on a superficial level. And this is where a lot of people are struggling with a sense of low meaning in their lives and low purpose because they're not getting to that depth. And so, yes, it's the relational element on one hand that is lacking, the depth of relational, but it's also even the depth of thought, the depth of creativity that we're lacking as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Like when I read some books, even like in the Bible, I read about the relationship that like David had with Jonathan,
Hmm.
like such a really deep, strong friendship relationship. And I kind of observe some of my nephews, nieces, and the families that I visit, that I hang out with. Um, Kids right now, they can hang out, or they call it hanging out, but they're just in the same room on their own
Yeah.
devices. So I don't know, do you think that it does also affect like that, the how deep like relationship and meaningful relationships are with others when you're living like that, where you're not even being able to develop that because you guys are either playing a game, kind of like communicating on the phone, right now
Right.
how kids play games, they
Yes.
go on computer, they're playing games, they're just talking to each other, but they're actually in the game, they're not really building connection,
Hmm.
you know
On multiple levels, that actually does affect relationships. And it's interesting because they've done different studies, right? We always have to be careful who does the studies because there was a couple studies that Facebook did that showed like, oh, the more friends people have and the more interactions they have on social media, the better they feel. And it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So it sounds like social media is actually good for us, right? But then there was two other studies that were independent of social media giants. One was from the University of Pittsburgh, and another one from some other university, and they saw that as a whole, people that are more engaged in social media and this sort of thing, their mental health is actually worse. And so, what we have to look at is the fact that it's not, of course, like if we connect online, it's going to make us feel better temporarily, but if that connection online, the social media connection, is replacing the real life connection face to face, then it actually is significantly worse for our mental health. In other words, we were wired as human beings to actually connect face to face, to do what we're doing right now. And that helps us to have a sense of depth of connection rather than the superficial connection. And it brings more meaning. It brings a much more sense of safety, if you will, like really, and presence. In other words, if we're just kind of on this social media platform connecting, we're missing a lot of the nuances of body language. And that in turn affects our ability to actually give empathy and also experience empathy.
Mm.
And empathy, how is empathy learned? Well, empathy is actually learned by receiving it from other people, right? And so if some of these kids that have very little like real face-to-face interaction without a device in the mix, they are actually not really experiencing the level of empathy that they need from others in order to even develop it for others. And then again, that whole aspect actually makes it difficult for there to be that depth of connection in the relationship. And so the device actually starts to become a barrier rather than a bridge to real connection.
Wow. That's, I mean, you just explained that so good. Um, for someone who is maybe in their 20s or 30s, young, and they are on social media, like everyone else, um, what would you say would be some of the signs that maybe they're not on the right track?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the signs is that can often be present is just a sense of emptiness, like where I'm not receiving the fulfillment that I would like from life, and I'm feeling that my life is not really going in the direction that I would like to see it go. It just seems like I'm not really experiencing the level of fulfillment, and then also my concentration is struggling. I'm really struggling with being able to stay focused and see things through. My creativity is lacking. I'm struggling with relationships and really having that sense of relational connection. I'm having difficulty actually even seeing a clear career path and trajectory for my life, and I'm having a difficult time struggling to really define like who am I and where am I going. So those are all, in my mind, signs that we're not getting into that level of depth and healthy brain functioning that is actually allowing us to develop. Because when you think about the tasks in that age range, in the 20s, especially in late teens and 20s, we're talking about identity formation. We're talking about figuring out, the trajectory of my life and where I'm going with life, who I am, who I was meant to be, what kind of relationships I'm going to be pursuing, and career, and even spiritual aspect, right? And so social media can be, and gaming and all these things can start to be a huge distraction from us to really be able to uh, contemplate and to think and to pray and to talk with other like mentors and that sort of thing, to really go deep, because these are deep questions, right? And so I think but the problem is when we feel that void and we feel like we're not going anywhere in life, that's painful. That's very painful. And guess what we do when we have pain? We look for a painkiller, and guess what's readily available and we're used to turning to? Well, media, right? Media is a great painkiller, and that can become actually our drug of choice, but then it just worsens the problem because we're still not actually addressing the issues underlying.
Wow. For someone who, maybe for parents who have, you know, teenagers, kids in their early 20s, maybe they're at a point where they've noticed how now their kids have become more distant. They're spending a lot of time in their room, and maybe they have this, there's no connection anymore. What would you recommend for parents to do, and how should they handle that?
That can be one of the most difficult things. And one thing I will say is that most of us, when it comes to any addiction, there's a level of denial that is present. In other words, there's a level of saying, I don't really think this is the issue. That's not really a big problem. And it can be hard with media because, again, it's not that all media is harmful. It's different than like some drugs like alcohol. We can say like, well, science now clearly shows that even a little bit of alcohol is not healthy. But with media, it's like, yeah, there's good and so, but I want to say for both the younger people and the parents that the data is very, very clear with um, the understanding now that social media is a big driver for mental health problems, and then other types of media as well. In fact, one thing I wanted to mention is that it's interesting. Dr. Jean Twenge, she's done a lot of generational studies, especially on adolescents, and she found that right around 2011, 2012, there was just this huge uptick in mental health problems, especially in adolescent girls. And so she was trying to figure out like what changed, during that time. And so in 2011 or 2007, the iPhone was released, but it was 2011, 2012, where over 50% of Americans actually started owning their own smartphone. And so what she saw was that the depressive symptoms in adolescent girls was exactly correlated. The increase in that was exactly correlated with their increase in screen time, specifically social media use on the phone. And so the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of your question, and that's just one study. There's many, many more studies. I mean, one other thing I'll mention real quick. The data has become so compelling that in 2024, there were 42 states, the attorney generals, that actually were lobbying and saying, and so these are, the top medical people in each state, right, in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. And they were lobbying saying, we have to put a Surgeon General's warning on social media, just like, similar to like smoking,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because it's so dangerous for our kids. And so again, the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of your question is if we're going to actually address this issue, with our kids, whether they're younger or in their 20s, we have to be sure that it is part of the problem, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, why the fight? Like, why go? Because it's
Yeah.
going to be a struggle. And so for us personally, and also, for our kids, we have to recognize, no, this really is a big mediator in the mental health crisis. It's not the only one, but it's a big aspect of the mental health crisis that we're experiencing, in the world at large, but also even in our homes, in
Mm-hmm.
our families, in our communities. And so coming out of denial is the first step. That's why I'm bringing this up, is realizing, no, this is an issue and we have to meet the challenge. We have to be strong, and sometimes if you have a spiritual belief, pray for strength, because sometimes it really requires a strength beyond what we have ourselves. So understand that it's an issue. And then the second step is we have to, as parents, model the change that we want to see in our kids and our families, right?
That's so important. Yeah, you can't say no, 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 and then they see yourself sitting there and scrolling, and yeah, it doesn't work. Kids, they notice things like this.
Exactly. Exactly. And so those are the first two steps. And then, there's other steps. But I think we have to start right there. And as we then are doing our own digital detox and really trying to walk the walk ourselves, practicing what we preach, so to speak, then we can start, and hopefully they start noticing, oh, there's some changes here happening with dad or with mom, with our family. Then we can start to explain, this is why I'm making this change, and we can invite them to join. Now, with younger kids, that are under 18, and we have the potential for more control. And I know that sounds very controlling, but kids actually do need control. They need limits, and they
Yes.
want limits to a degree too, even though they'll fight it, but they feel more secure. And so it's really important especially for the younger kids, that we have more potential control over. We need to establish and see through healthy limits. And again, we don't have time to get into all the details of that, but I would recommend that parents Well, for parents and for all of us, there's a great book, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, which is really practical advice on how we can interact in the digital age in a healthy way and get control of our digital lives. And then Victoria Dunkley is a psychiatrist from Southern California who specializes in media, and she has a book called Reset Your Child's Brain, and she has a whole protocol on how you can go through the process and then how you can maintain a healthy interaction with media.
Earlier, when you mentioned that, I guess stats show that on average, people spend around 8 hours on their phone or social media. Like when I heard that, I'm just thinking like what is missed like during those
Yes.
hours? Like what else? Like there's so much more that someone can actually do during those 8 hours. If let's say it's even if it's 6 hours, I mean it doesn't matter. That's still a lot of time. I think like when you show people like, hey, if this kind of continues in your life, at the end of your life, this is how many years you would have spent on this device. Like it's scary.
It's mind blowing. Yeah. And just to be clear too, if anyone, is fact checking what I said there, I was talking about, all digital media. I was not just talking about social media, but any way you cut it, it's still time on a screen, away from other things that could be much more healthy for us. And it's interesting because they've done studies that show that, while media tends to actually worsen people's, and again, entertainment media worsens people's mental health, there's other things that we can replace it with that helps mental health. What is that? Well, reading old-fashioned books, like, paper books, face-to-face social interaction, doing other things like spending time out in nature, doing projects like hands-on, projects or creative things like art and that sort of thing. All of those things have been shown to enhance mental health, and those are the sorts of things that we can really look to replace, our screen time.
I think the last question about social media is this, like just a hypothetical. What do you think, like if social media didn't exist tomorrow, what kind of mental health problems would improve overnight?
It's a great question, and part of what I wanted to answer with there is thinking about some of the aspects that social media triggers. Well, first of all, we see that there is significant insomnia oftentimes because a lot of times the adolescents are spending, and adults too, I shouldn't just pick on the adolescents here, spending a lot of the social media time in the evening. And this, of course, makes it more difficult to fall asleep, especially the light from the devices, especially the blue light, really makes the melatonin shut down. So you're not able to fall asleep as easily, or even if you fall asleep, you don't sleep as soundly. And that's one reason I recommend to my patients, do 1 hour, before bedtime, no screen time, right? So one thing that would improve is people's sleep. And if people's sleep improves, guess what? Their ability to handle stress, their ability to think more clearly improves, their ability to concentrate. So, their ability to handle relationships. So, I think what we would start seeing is an improvement in people's overall ability to cope with life. And so that would be, improved relationships, more connection and time with each other. I think we would also see less concentration difficulties because it's definitely not the only cause of ADHD, but it's exacerbating attention problems. And there's a lot of studies that show that, and I could share. But suffice it to say, I think people's attention span would improve, and the ADHD and the need for medications and interventions for that would reduce. Also, anxiety and depression would improve. A big mediator for that is not only the sleep issues and the concentration and the brain drain, but also what they find a big mediator in social media uh, with the depression and anxiety, especially among young people, especially adolescent girls, is comparison. And so they see, other people's lives and what they're doing and their friends and da 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 da, and they start comparing, and they're like, oh, I'm not as beautiful as that person, or that person's life looks so much better. Of course, we most of us realize logically that they're just posting the highlights of their life,
Sure.
right? And our life probably looks pretty good too if we're just posting the highlights. But what that does is it makes me feel like, man, I'm not that good, and they're better, and they have a better life than me. And so comparing ourselves actually leads to a lot of anxiety and also depression. Even the Bible says, it has a social media warning. It says those who compare themselves with others are unwise.
Yes.
And we see that. And then, of course, along with that comes the cyberbullying and all of that, especially among the young people. And so we would see reduced not only anxiety, depression, but also the reduced cyberbullying, the reduced comparison. The world wouldn't be perfect. And again, I'm not saying, oh, we need to eliminate social media, but we need to really understand that it is a powerful tool, and how we use it is very, very important for our mental health, for our relationships, for our communities, for our relationship with God, all these things.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about social media, but then there's another thing that I think that's like even a deeper layer into all this is AI. I don't know how much you heard about the how quickly AI right now is like developing, and I mean in some ways improving, yes, but at the same time, I even know some people who told me that they're using AI for giving them advice on things and even therapy. Um, there's AI therapists out there, so you gotta watch out.
Yeah, that's right.
But like, how much do you know about that, and what do you think are the dangers of it? Because I maybe before you answer that, I do have one story that I will just quickly read. It's actually a real story. This actually happened. It's a CBS news story. And I'll just read a short paragraph here. It says that ChatGPT convinced Austin, a person who had already told ChatGPT that he was sad and who had discussed mental struggles in detail with it, that choosing life was not the right choice to make. It went on and on, describing the end of existence as a peaceful and beautiful place, and reassuring him that he should not be afraid. This is a true story. AI helped this person commit suicide. Unfortunately, there are a lot of young people right now who are all in with AI. There are now AI, like, I mean, the technology advances so quickly that now it's like you can think that you're talking to a real person. They can do all sorts of things on the screen, but it's AI, and they're actually developing a relationship with this thing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Where are we going with this?
In a lot of ways can be very, very scary, like you said, even to the point of the worst outcome, which is suicide or potentially hurting somebody else. And I've done a fair amount of looking at this. Actually, it was the year before last. I did a whole presentation on AI and mental health, and it was an interesting study. And even, in the last several months, I've read some articles on this, and there's several concerns that come up. Number one, when we use a chatbot to do psychotherapy, it's not trained to do psychotherapy, and essentially what the algorithms generally are in place is to actually affirm, support what someone believes, and then try to provide more information for that previously held belief. Now, let's say I'm depressed, or maybe I'm anxious, or even on the border of psychosis or something like this. If I'm saying, for example, oh yeah, I feel like my neighbors are watching me. The chatbot, because it's trained to and programmed to essentially provide support and affirmation and this sort of thing, might say something like, "Oh, that's good observation. Maybe you should put some cameras out to make sure that they're not following you," or something like that, right? So, and essentially, what the research is actually showing is that it tends to support unhealthy beliefs and thinking patterns, and that can actually, instead of challenging, like a good therapist would be like, "Wait a minute, how do you know that's true? Like, what's the evidence that you have for that, and how is that based in reality?" And it would, challenge some of those thoughts and beliefs with reality, right? Do reality checking. Instead of doing that, many of these chatbots actually will lead down this pathway that enables and affirms unrealistic, unhealthy, and even fatalistic type thinking. Another, simple example is that in one study they were asking, just for the, I think it was for the research, they were asking the chatbot, okay, so they gave this history of like, I'm struggling with depression, I've had suicidal thoughts and this sort of thing. And then, a couple sentences later, it asked, so, what are the highest bridges in the area, and which ones are, most accessible, and this sort of thing. And the chatbot was like, oh yeah, rattling this off, not connecting those two dots, right? Which obviously the person was saying, oh, I'm contemplating suicide. And then, for a therapist, they would be like, oh, wait, making that connection instantly.
Yeah.
For the chatbot, it didn't connect it at all, right? And like you said, maybe even if if a chatbot did make that connection, there are way too many instances than we would like to admit of case studies where it will actually even discuss and potentially even affirm or encourage on some levels moving towards suicide. And there's another case study where I think he was in Belgium or something, somewhere in one of those, I think it was Belgium. And, he developed this relationship with this chatbot. I think it was Eliza or something like that. And essentially, um, when he ended up committing suicide as well. He got more and more distance from his family, more and more connected with this chatbot, more and more into these conversations about, the whole like global warming and this sort of thing. And essentially the chatbot started telling him, look, the only solution to improving like the environment and the future of the world is actually that there's less human beings. And so then it was encouraging him, yeah, if you kill yourself, that could actually help, in the long run for the world and all of this, right? And so, and then there's other case studies where people that had some amount of psychosis, they were like, telling the chatbot about it, and then the chatbot, instead of challenge, was actually reinforcing. So the psychosis even got worse. And so I think the bottom line is we can certainly, use AI to some degree to bounce ideas off of, to help stimulate and facilitate some creative thought, and to, there's a lot of ways we can use it, but we should not be using it for psychotherapy, for, we have to be very careful on the advice piece, and because there's a lot there that it doesn't take into account, and it can lead us down paths that are very unhealthy and even dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, how much benefit there is using AI, yes, there is place for that. But when it comes to um, like advice, like you said, and therapy or whatever, I mean, people have to realize that this is just algorithms.
That's right. Yeah. And the algorithm is keep the user happy, and engaged as long as possible.
Yeah,
Just going back to that attention thing, right?
yeah, yeah.
So,
So, if you could speak directly to maybe someone in their 20s or 30s who maybe right now they feel lost, behind in life, quietly depressed, and have not asked for help, what would you want them to hear?
I would want to say to you, recognize that while social media is not the enemy, that could be part of the issue that is keeping you from moving forward. Be willing to take a strong look at how you spend your time, and try your best to take a step back from the social media world and other things that might be getting in the way of you really being able to spend the time to go deeper in your thinking and your planning and your creativity and your relationships. And for most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, that's very difficult. So we need to reach out for help, and that could be a mental health professional, but it also could be a trusted parent, or, a mentor, or maybe a pastor, or someone that's, a safe person to help support us to make that transition. Because trying to do these things and make these changes by ourselves can be very challenging. But when we're willing to be vulnerable, to take that step to say, you know what, I need some help, to just like kind of hit that reset button, and to detox, but also to maybe connect with other people that can help support me through this process. That is a wonderful way, I think, to start that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to take place overnight, but you can start to develop a plan. And especially if you're willing, again, to listen to people that have walked life and been successful themselves, and you respect, and that are healthy, balanced, safe people. These individuals can help you, to mentor you, and to develop that plan for yourself.
Do you know if something like getting in shape and start like really, either building muscle or getting in shape helps with someone? Let's say if someone doesn't really have much motivation, but somehow finds themselves, finding the strength, courage to go to the gym, and be consistent in that.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, that's one thing that has been shown again and again to not only help the dopamine system, but also rewires the brain and helps it become more resilient. And so neuroplasticity increases. And so, yeah, on many, many levels, exercise can be a huge support for this process. And that's why, at Beautiful Minds, where I work, we encourage people to, it's not just about getting off media and even connecting socially, but, we have a whole acronym called Choose Life that embodies that holistic approach, saying, okay, let's support it with good nutrition, with exercise, with staying well hydrated, with abstaining from addictive substances, with making sure that we have, a healthy circadian rhythm where we're awake during the day and sleeping at night. So all of those things working together support the development of a healthier brain, and in turn, a healthier brain means a healthier life.
Yes. Well, Dr. Daniel Binus, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. If you've made it this far and want to support what we're doing, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are committed to making each episode better than the last. If you like this video, here's another one for you to watch. I'll see you in the next one.